maybe that these years from 1945 to 2025, maybe those years are the outlier. And that although you and I have grown up in them, they seem normal, perfectly reasonable. That's how we spent half of our lives. In fact, maybe the world is going back to the way it was for the 1,000 years before 1945.
Welcome to the Diplomacy Podcast, where we explore how diplomacy shapes our world and our lives. I'm Nicholas Colin. It's almost the end of 2025, and we're looking at the year in diplomacy. My guest today is Ambassador Marc Grossman, one of the most respected and celebrated, even, career diplomats of the last several decades, I might say. Ambassador Grossman spent 32 years in the Foreign Service. He was ambassador to Turkey, Assistant Secretary of State for European Affairs, Director General of the Foreign Service, and the Secretary of State for Political Affairs. And after retirement, he came back as the Special Representative for Pakistan and Afghanistan. And now he is Vice Chair of the Cohen Group, which is a strategic business advisory firm. Ambassador, welcome. Great to see you again.
Nick, thank you very much for having me, and thanks for that kind introduction.
We are in December of 2025. The world does not look quite like it did in January. How different does it look to you?
Well, first again, thank you very much. And Nick, before I start, let me thank you for all of your contributions to the understanding of diplomacy and your support for American diplomats. We appreciate it. And so thank you very much.
This reminds me to do something that I forgot to do at the beginning, and that is to announce for the first time on the podcast that we have created at the Washington International Diplomatic Academy the first ever course in diplomacy for the general public. So this is not the practical training we provide to aspiring and working diplomats, but for people who perhaps are fans of The Diplomat, the show on Netflix. And I'm saying that because the show's creator told me that she drew on my book, America's Other Army, which is a book about the Foreign Service, when she was creating the show and developing it. And she also said that she and her staff still refer to the book as they write. And as we now know, they're writing season 4 currently. So it's a very popular show. That course that I mentioned begins in January. We are now accepting applications. So please go to diplomaticacademy.us and take a look at what the course specifically offers.
It just sounds like a great idea to open a course like this to the general public.
Well, I figured now is the time because
right.
I don't remember anything else in pop culture that has brought at least the idea of diplomacy to more people. So we go to the first question. Go ahead now.
So I think there's no question that 2025 has been a very consequential year, and it's certainly different in diplomacy at the end of the year than it was at the beginning of the year. And I'd highlight 3 things, it seems to me, that are really working to make this true. Number one, I think you've seen all through the year a focus on geopolitics, on geoeconomics, and geotechnology. And I think what has made this year so special is the fact that those 3 units of diplomacy or in the area are now being dealt with simultaneously. And that's great power competition, the way people think about economic and national security. And these questions of economics are really now at the top of everybody's agenda. We went through over the past few years a time when there was great power competition, then counterterrorism, back to great power competition. And now you really see this effort for people to understand and manage the questions of geopolitics. I think also this year there has certainly been an increase in people's interest in geoeconomics and how economics and national security really are part and parcel of the same conversation now. And one of the reasons for that is that geotechnology, AI, quantum, all these kinds of things have really become national security questions and therefore diplomatic questions. The other thing I would say, I think, is that I think some people think, well, all these things started in January of 2025. I think actually what we're seeing is a long-term set of trends that have become more and more important. And it's a growing backlash I know that you have studied and others on your programs have talked about this growing backlash to what we used to call the rules-based international order. And one of the challenges, of course, of that order is that nobody really understood what it meant, and that's certainly true of the public. And I think it's really telling that in his confirmation hearing, one of the things that now Secretary Rubio said was that the post-war global order is not just obsolete, it's working against the interests of the United States. And that's a feeling, I think, not just in America, but around the world. And so this question's been growing for 20 years. And I don't say that this backlash against globalization is the only reason things have changed or the only reason there have been challenges. But I think it's an important one. There's a lot of dissatisfaction around the world in publics about their economic situation. And it isn't just this question of how much things cost. I think a lot of people think, hey, this globalization thing, it must have worked for somebody, but it doesn't work for me. And then the other question that is the whole question of cultural change and societal change. And people, I think, have felt a loss in national identity and sovereignty. And so these are, I think, very much the themes of 2025. And I'll give you two more that I was thinking about. One is, I don't know what you think about this thought, but it may be, and I don't know the answer, I'm just thinking about this. It may be that these years from 1945 to 2025, maybe those years are the outlier. And that although you and I have grown up in them, they seem normal, perfectly reasonable. That's how we spent half of our lives. In fact, maybe the world is going back to the way it was for the 1,000 years before 1945. I don't know the answer to that question. And then the second thing is, how is it that we're going to manage this intersection of geopolitics, geoeconomics, and geotechnologies? These seem to me to be themes and agenda items that have really come on to our world in very clearly in 2025.
Let's look at the diplomacy behind some of these and other developments we've witnessed this year. When you look at just not US, but diplomacy globally, because there is diplomacy without the United States, in fact, increasingly so, as we just saw with both the G20 summit in South Africa and the COP meeting in Brazil. What do you think have been some of the highs in diplomacy this year?
Well, I think that's a great question. I think I would add a kind of highs, kind of a to be determined still, right? And maybe there are some things that haven't gone so far very well. I think from the perspective of an observer of United States diplomacy, it seems to me that there have been some themes that have gone pretty well. So I would list there NATO. I think the way people were thinking about how President Trump might approach NATO in the very beginning of his administration, especially based on his first administration, I think where they've come out with NATO has been pretty good. There's a reaffirmation of Article 5. And also, very importantly, Nick, there's also been finally, the effort by the allies to increase their defense spending. And so you have 3.5% in defense, 1.5% in defense infrastructure. That's all, I think, a really good thing. Secondly, and these, I guess, are around mostly in the Middle East. I happen to think, and I don't know whether you would agree, I happen to think that the policy we're pursuing right now on Syria is a pretty sensible one. I think it was remarkable that President Trump, had President Shah to the White House. But what he said was true, which is that you got to give Syria a chance now to be a country where it won't radiate instability, but perhaps would radiate stability. And I know there's a lot of argument about that, and other people don't agree with that, but I would put it on a list of things that seem to me a pretty positive foundation. I think similarly in the Middle East, I think a great accomplishment of our foreign policy in the first Trump administration were the Abraham Accords. And I think it's really very good that they've kept a focus on those things and trying to, get Saudi Arabia to be closer to the Abraham Accords, other countries to participate. I think the Abraham Accords are a very interesting way to think about the future organization of the Middle East. And then finally, I think this focus on supply chain resiliency, which is really a diplomatic question, and the focus on critical minerals, the focus on getting allies in the United States together to deal with some of these questions is a really important one. And again, I consider it diplomacy, but we've seen a lot more promises of investment by people outside the United States into the United States. And if those investments were to come and, reinvigorate parts of our country, I think that'd be a very good thing. So I would list some of those things as positives during this year.
All right, what are the things to be determined?
I'd say there are a number of things to be determined or still need work. I think tariff policies are still something that need work. We don't know the end of that story. There's so many negotiations still going on. The United States and the EU still haven't come to really a specific agreement. And so the question is kind of what's the purpose of the tariffs? And for that, I've read very carefully some of the writings of Jameson Greer, the U.S. trade representative, where he talks about the tariffs as being a way to create what he calls a conservative society based on production, not on debt, and also to give the United States more autonomy in making its decisions. And then also the administration has used tariffs to try to move forward on specific diplomatic questions like fentanyl or illegal migration, supply chain resilience, as we were talking about, human trafficking. So I think that's a category of being worked on, still needs work. Hard to know whether it turns out all well or maybe all partially well. And then I think you have the places where there's still terrible conflict, right? You have Gaza, for example. So if you think just about Gaza ceasefire, well, that would have to go into the success category. Absolutely. But it's connected to a bigger, larger question about the future of Gaza and the future of Palestinians and the future of Israelis and how they work all that out. And so I hope the president will continue to focus on that question because he brings a lot of, capacity there. But as they go ahead and produce the international force, think about economic redevelopment in Gaza, all these questions, I think I still put this in the area of work to do. Similarly, you'd have to put, I hope you'd agree, Ukraine in that similar category. Which is, a terrible conflict. Maybe there's movement now towards some kind of resolution. I certainly hope so. For all the lives and all the destruction that has been done there. But you'd have to put this into the category of more work to be done. And I'll give you two others. One is China, where there are questions of trade. There are questions of chips, and very important materials. And then, of course, there's China's military buildup in the Pacific. And so I would put China in that category of much more work to be done. And then finally, Iran, which is to say that the Iranians are in a completely different strategic situation than they were before, given what the Israelis have done to Hamas, to Hezbollah, what the United States did in bombing the nuclear facilities in Iran. And so the question is it possible to think in a new way for the Iranians and for the rest of the world about the future of that area? And I'd put that in the lots of work still to be done category as well.
To me, a lot of what's happened with the attempts at peace in Ukraine has been a low, specifically in terms of the diplomatic incompetence that has come out, right? That's why I put it in lows. But let me not put things in your mouth. So what do you think were the lows?
I think that there's been a series of challenges. Number one is, as you put your finger on it, is the question of consistency. And I may be old-fashioned in this regard, and I was trained maybe as an old-fashioned diplomat, some people would say, but I think consistency in message, consistency in pursuing strategy, consistency in dealing with some of these problems is a really important thing. And so I would say over the past year, or maybe looking forward, I would hope that American diplomacy would be kind of more consistent. But as I say, you could consider that an old-fashioned view. I also think that we shouldn't forget that one of the great, great, great advantages of the United States is we have real allies and friends. And so we need to protect that great possibility for us. And so, and maybe you can talk about it in your courses. I've been struggling to find a way to talk about this, maybe by using a business concept, Nick, of return on investment. And I don't mean the money, please. It's the idea that how do you balance the need to have the right kind of trading relationship with Canada, for example, and yet you realize that Canada is this enormous piece of geography to our north with 41 million people. And they should be our friends, right? We should be working closely with Canada. And so I think somehow there's a question for future diplomats, for modern diplomacy, of how do you bring the concept of return on investment? And again, not money, but thought. How do you bring that into the conversation? And then the other thing that I would say, and I've been reading a little bit, as I know you have, about the enormous strides the Chinese have made in alternative energies and solar and wind, and huge amount of energy being created there. And my view is that some of the biggest jumps ahead in AI and quantum are going to be based on who can produce the lowest cost electricity. And, leave the whole question of climate change aside. And I don't mean to denigrate it, but leave it aside for a second. This is an economic question. And so I would like to see the United States be in the all of the above category when it comes to energy production. And I hope that'll change. That'll be a different way of thinking as well.
So let me get back to diplomatic skill, diplomatic competence, and try to make sense of what we've seen in the most recent effort with a peace plan for Ukraine. Why do you think no one, at least in office currently, seems to learn that you cannot do diplomacy like a real estate deal? It takes much more than that. What are your thoughts on all that?
I think in terms of special envoys, and I don't know Mr. Wickoff. What I think though is there's a fundamental misunderstanding of people who come into the government and they are very suspicious of the State Department and very suspicious of the Foreign Service. But there's a misunderstanding here. And the misunderstanding here is that the State Department employees, Foreign Service employees like myself, we're not there to make the policy. We're there to carry out the policy that the president and the Secretary of State and the chain of command puts out, right? So it's the execution of the policy that we might be able to provide some useful, sort of useful input to. And I think what happens is people come from the outside and they say, oh, I have to make sure that, we don't really get captured, as you say, by the State Department, by the Foreign Service, in terms of making the policy. And I think that's a fair point, right? That's not the job of the institution. The job of the institution is to put up alternatives and then execute the policy as it is decided. And so I hope as they kind of move along here, they can meet some people at the State Department in the career services, civil service, foreign service, who show them that's actually what we're here to do. We're not here to make the policy for you. We're here to follow the policy that the president and the Secretary of State say is the policy. That's what the chain of command is about.
As you've watched the Ukrainians, what are your thoughts on their own diplomacy?
Certainly my interaction with Ukrainian diplomats and what they have been able to accomplish over these past couple of years is astonishing, really. I think that this war has shown that the Ukrainian people are prepared to fight for their own, for the capacity to make their own choices and fight for their own culture and fight for their country and fight for their own way of life. And I would think that anyone who was a Ukrainian diplomat would be so inspired by that you were bound to raise up your game, right? If you said, I have the privilege of representing these people who since February of 2022 have, held off the Russian state, have maintained their own state, have lost thousands and thousands of people. And every day you wake up and, some part of Ukraine has been bombed or droned. And, it isn't military. It's not a military operation. They kill school kids and they hit power plants. And so I think if you're a diplomat representing these people, then you better up your game and be the best that you can.
What about Russian diplomacy? As you know, for a long time, the so-called School of Russian Diplomacy has been praised far and wide around the world, right? About the skills of Russian diplomats and all that. How do you look at the Russian diplomacy currently and the state it is in?
Well, I think they have a much harder story to tell, and they have a much harder set of policies to promote, and they have a much harder job. I would say. And so, I would say that to be a Russian diplomat now, is to be pursuing a lot of policies, not just in Ukraine, but around the world, especially if you're involved in Russian public diplomacy, for goodness sakes, of trying to undermine the West and do things in a way that are, not good for the whole, for relations around the world. I think it's a really hard job, and I wouldn't want to have it.
How do you assess the tone and the style of the administration's diplomacy? Because, as you know, many people around the world judge the United States exactly by that, by the tone and the style and sort of the message it's sending, rather than necessarily the nitty-gritty policy substance.
It's different, right? No question. That's the answer to the question. The issue is, why is it different? And I think that part of this belongs to diplomats. Because, for example, as we said before, diplomats stand up and say, we love the rules-based international order. And then they sit down. So what's that mean? And as you do your course for the public, right, one of the questions they'll have was, what's that mean exactly? And unless you have an answer to that question that people can understand, then you're not making any progress. Or I'll give you another thought, which is, I think one of the big challenges of the world today for diplomacy is that there's a huge gap between what the elites define as the national interest and what the general public defines as the national interest. And you don't have to look any farther than what happened during COVID to see that, right? People found out we didn't make gowns and gloves in the United States. We'd subcontracted all of our medicine out to somebody else. So whose interest was that in? How did that happen? And if diplomats are going to succeed in the future, they're going to have to find a way to close that gap, and make the definition of national security, the definition of national interest, coincide a lot more than it does now with, I think, how the public thinks about that. And I would imagine if Donald Trump was sitting here talking to you, he would say, I'm doing a much better job of that, right? My diplomacy is much clearer about what's in the interests of, larger groups of people in the United States, and that people don't like it. Well, too bad. And so, this is a choice we have to make. If diplomacy is going to make a comeback, which I hope it will, then it has to deal with with closing this gap and understanding the challenges that, a very large number of people in the United States and around the world face.
Quite a few things have changed in the Foreign Service in the past 10, 11 months now. Anything that particularly worries you, especially how the service's members have been treated?
I think for me, the worrisome thing is the loss of expertise and the loss of capacity at the State Department. And I would imagine that at some stage, I hope people will realize that you just can't kind of say this office, and this office goes, without doing damage to the institution. That said, the State Department needs reform, right? And I've been involved over the past few years in a number of efforts to reform the State Department. So I think the important thing here, Nick, is that people have to recognize when they talk about change at the State Department, change in the Foreign Service, that it's not going back to the way it was, because the way it was wasn't so great. The way it was needed reform. And the question is how to create that reform, pursue that reform, and still have an institution to call upon, because the United States of America needs a high functioning diplomacy. It needs a high functioning State Department. And the question is how to create those things. And that ought to be a bipartisan issue. It ought to be something we can all work on together.
From what I know, for 4 years, every day, work day, at 5 p.m., you met in the secretary's office, right? So it was Colin Powell, his deputy, Rich Armitage, you, and was it the undersecretary for
Grant Green.
management?
Correct.
That's right.
Correct.
How do you remember those meetings? Anything in particular you learned from them that you didn't quite know before?
I learned a lot in those meetings. I learned a lot about leadership. Watching Colin Powell, watching Rich Armitage, watching Grant Green. I knew something about leadership. Been privileged to have a number of positions, but I learned a lot about leadership from them. And I learned how important it was always, to be thinking about the people who worked in that building, who worked for Colin Powell every day. And it was really inspirational. And the other thing I learned is that every once in a while, in a days like we had, as you can imagine, it was a good thing to sit for a few minutes and maybe have a laugh or two.
Thank you, Ambassador, for your time and your insight.
Well, thank you very much for having me. I appreciate it.
Thank you for joining us. Remember, diplomacy is the world's best hope. See you next time.